What's up troops, it's me TheTacticalBrit and I'm here today with some more Battlefield intel. Now today we're going to be looking at the pre-order pack for the brand new Battlefield game, and that is of course the Harlem Hellfighters pre-order pack. Now pre-order pack aside, because that's of course a touch and go subject, and there's lots of things we could talk about why that isn't right and why it is potentially right in terms of marketing, but I want to focus today on the lore of the Harlem Hellfighters because I jumped in to some serious research on what these guys were about and what this group was about, and quite frankly I was astounded by what I found, and today I'm going to be giving you some of that intel too. Now, I'm not going to claim to be some omniscient guy or whatever. I actually just jumped onto the internet and did a lot of research, and it's very likely what you're going to hear from me today is just going to be a summarized version of what is available on the internet, and I do strongly encourage you to read around this, of course, if you want, and this video will just simply act as a summarizing lore of the Harlem Hellfighters, and there will probably be lots of images, there'll probably be lots of intel that you could gather yourselves on them, and I'm sure there will be some facts, of course, that I miss out, so please do read around and search around beyond this. So, who are the Harlem Hellfighters, and what do they have to do with the World War setting and the World War era? Now, the Harlem Hellfighters, who are formerly known as the 369th Infantry Regiment, was a section of the United States Army National Guard that saw action in World War I and World War II. What's really interesting about this regiment is that it consisted almost entirely of African Americans and African Puerto Ricans, and was known for being the first African American regiment to serve with American Expeditionary Forces during World War I. Now, before this was formed, any African American that wanted to fight in the war either had to enlist with the French or the Canadian armies. Now, bearing in mind, this is the early 20th century, and unfortunately at this time, racial segregation in general was still pretty widespread across the board, especially in America at this time. So you actually couldn't enlist for the United States if you were a black person, which is incredibly tragic, but they finally did form this regiment because the United States was running out of infantry and needed everybody that they could possibly get. Now, this regiment racked up quite a few nicknames: the Harlem Hellfighters, the Black Rattlers, and the Men of Bronze, which was given to them by the French. Now, the nickname Hellfighters was given to them by the Germans themselves, their enemy that they were fighting during the wars, due to their toughness and due to the fact that they never ever lost a man through capture, lost a trench, or lost a foot of ground to the enemy. These guys were literally as badass as it gets on the battlefield, and some of the battles that you can read around and research into, and some of which I will feature today, have been really incredible to learn about. But put this into context, especially around World War I, which was about trench warfare and losing and gaining ground quite significantly, these guys never saw a single one of their members captured, and whenever they were on the field, they never lost ground. It just didn't happen, regardless of what battle or situation they were in, or where the enemy was, or where they pressed. These guys always won. They never retreated and they never fell back, which is quite frankly a statistic that in World War I is pretty much unheard of. So the Harlem Hellfighters were the first all-black regiment that actually helped change the Americans' public opinion on African American soldiers, and really did help pave the way for African American soldiers in the future as well. So exactly how impactful were the Harlem Hellfighters during the World War era? Well, the statistics for this is actually pretty scary, and I'm bringing up here some events and examples which just go to show how incredibly effective these guys were as a force. Now, while overseas, the Harlem Hellfighters saw propaganda intended for them by the Germans. The Germans claimed that they had done nothing wrong to black people, and instead insisted that it was the Americans that they should be fighting, as they had oppressed them for years. The men and soldiers who served with the Harlem Hellfighters in fact claimed that after seeing this propaganda, it made them more adept to the US cause and more interested in fighting for the Allies, because they recognized themselves as Americans, rightly so. And the Germans had tried to say that no, they were not that, they were just black people who were living in a country that they didn't fit in. And of course these guys were fighting and putting their lives on the line for their country and for the Allied cause. And in actuality, this propaganda had the entirely opposite effect, and these people really were committed to fighting at an intense level against the Germans. So now let's talk about some events during history that these guys were very much important in. Now, on September 25th, 1918, the French 4th Army went on an offensive with the Americans, and the 396th Regiment, otherwise more formally known as the Harlem Hellfighters, suffered severe losses at this time. But what was important is that they captured the village of Sechold. Now, that may be pronounced wrong, but that's roughly what I can see. Now, at one point, and this is the amazing fact about this event when they tried to capture this village, the Harlem Hellfighters advanced faster than any other troops at the time. Now, bearing in mind during World War I, it was all about your flanks and making sure that you had all of your flanks covered and that you didn't get cut off and isolated and eventually killed off by the enemies. But at one point, they went so far forward that their right and left flanks were risked of being cut off. But by the time the regiment had pulled back to reorganize and reinstitute themselves with the French troops, they had advanced 8.7 miles, otherwise known as 14 kilometers for those of you who use the imperial system, through severe German resistance. Now, when I say these guys never lost a foot of ground, it's exactly that. Imagine advancing over 8 miles through literally an entire force of Germans as an isolated regiment. Absolutely terrifying. Although they did suffer severe losses, they captured this village, and it was a momentous occasion during World War I, especially considering the French at the time had been taking severe losses on that front. And this links in quite nicely into my next point. Now, the 369th Regiment were actually relied upon in battle for morale. And by the end of their tour, they had become one of the famous military brands across the world. Now, this followed the 396 overseas, and they were highly regarded for being helpful with army commanders who were trying to get their troops back on their feet, trying to feel as though the losses that they had suffered were not as bad, and that these guys could come over and help them out. Now, although they only represented 1% of all soldiers deployed, they were responsible for over 20% of the territory assigned to the United States. During the 369th Regimental Band, they became pretty famous throughout Europe and had introduced even things like American jazz to the British and French and other audiences, and even made it internationally demanded for because they had kind of influenced their culture on other soldiers. And it's just really impressive to see how such a small regiment can change so much for a war. You know, that tiny 1% of all soldiers managed to make such a difference and boost in morale, and managed to capture villages and go on these offensives that, quite frankly, nobody in their right mind would have done. Now, in mid-October, the regiment was moved to a sector in the mountains, and it was on there that the 11th of November was the day of armistice. Now, 6 days later, the 369th made its last advance on the 26th of November 1918 and reached the banks of the River Rhine. And of course, the Rhineland is the outer regions of Germany. They were the first Allied unit to reach it. That's a pretty crazy statistic, bearing in mind that, you know, even an armistice being called doesn't necessarily show that nobody's going to take a loss of life during the armistice period. It doesn't mean people are just going to throw down their guns. It's war, and people were still going to be very much tense at this time. And as many of you have actually revised with Weimar Germany from 1918 sort of into 1933 before it became an autocracy again, it actually took President Wilson 2 weeks to respond to the armistice message from Prince Max Baden, who said that the Kaiser had abdicated and that they were going to introduce constitutional democracy. At this point, Germany had realized that they lost the war, and regiments such as the 369th had essentially put Germany back in their own lands and made it so that they were in a state of retreat. Now, because of this, they called for armistice, and President Wilson proposed a 14-point plan to restore Germany and ensure that their economy and their people were treated fairly. Now, as many of you will know, that didn't happen. The Treaty of Versailles happened, and everything kind of goes downhill from there. But essentially, during those 2 weeks of armistice, it was the 369th's job just to make sure that nothing went down, to make sure that they were still retreating, and to ensure that no military activity was carrying on. Like I say, that 2 week delay was purely on the fact that they just didn't trust the Germans, especially after fighting them for so long. Now, this is the incredibly sad part about the 369th Regiment, and it's actually one of the reasons I'm incredibly proud that DICE has included them as a pre-order bonus and a reason to, you know, just study about these guys. What's incredibly sad about the 369th Regiment, or the Harlem Hellfighters, is how they were treated. Now, these guys were essentially recognized war heroes in so many different countries and regions, especially in France and especially across Europe. But when they returned to the United States, they were treated with intense racial discrimination and looked down upon. They suffered incredible harassment by American soldiers, and the American government that was supposed to represent them even sent pamphlets to the French troops, warning them that the black troops were of an inferior nature and supposedly had rapist tendencies of African Americans, which is incredibly sad and shocking considering that these men had fought and died for their country. It wasn't the worst thing though, because they were recognized war heroes in Europe. In France, the 369th were treated as if they were no different from any other French unit, and the French did not show hatred towards them or did not segregate the 369th. The 369th finally felt as though they were treated equally in the French regiment, and they were welcomed with open arms by the French government as well when they were returning to the United States through Europe. They were less concerned about their race than the Americans were short on troops, and they were less concerned about the fact that these people were black and what was associated with that at that time, because these guys had fought alongside them, and it had made a difference, and they'd fought and died for the French people as well, and the Allied cause. Now, I've got to say, researching this has been an absolute privilege, and I'm really glad I learned about this, because it's incredibly easy to forget about some of the groups who were involved in World War I and World War II. It wasn't just a simple case of, lots of burly white men rolled up into the war and, did their job. It was a really collective effort from everybody, all kinds of races, all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of genders, and it's such an incredible honor to learn about these kinds of people who fought against all odds, racial segregation. They weren't even allowed to enlist for their own army because they were treated as inferior, but they still fought and died alongside other troops, which is honestly one of the most astounding and resilient things I've ever read in quite a long time. Now, like I say, this might just be a pre-order bonus for Battlefield, and I do strongly suggest you guys read into this as much as you can. It's men like the Harlem Hellfighters who actually changed the view on African Americans back in America. They changed the view of them across Europe, and they changed the view because they humanized who they were. These people were treated with intense racial segregation to the point where they were treated as inhuman, and that's something that they fought against and showed when they died alongside other men during these wars. They showed that they were no different, and they were putting their lives on the line too. And quite frankly, that is such a huge social change. And the 369th are actually recognized for being the troops who changed the opinions of Americans very much so during the early 20th century. And after World War II, racial segregation had significantly reduced due to the fact that people were so aware of the fact that these men had fought and died for them as well. As a war veteran, I suppose that's the title you receive. You don't receive the title of black or white, you receive the title of I was a war veteran and I fought for my country. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the Harlem Hellfighters and the lore surrounding them, and I plan on doing lots of other lore videos about all the kinds of guns, gadgets and things that we learn about in the new Battlefield title, and potentially other groups that are involved as well. But I think it's really awesome reading about these people, and I do strongly recommend you do it too. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button down below, please give it a thumbs up, share it, and of course subscribe if you want to see some more Battlefield related content. It's been me, the Tactical Brit, and as always, thank you for watching.